You've probably heard people say sentences like this. If John studies hard, he will pass the exam. This is a conditional sentence. It has two parts. The first part starts with if and describes a situation that might be true or might not be true. John might study hard, but he might decide to play football instead. The second part describes what will happen if John does in fact study hard. In other words, it describes the consequence of John studying hard. We'll call the first part the if clause and the second part the consequence clause. All languages have ways to express conditional situations like this, but not all languages use a word like if in English. For example, in Swahili, spoken in East Africa, there is a word, ikiwa, that functions like if in English when the situation in the if clause is uncertain. However, in this case, it is more common to use the verbal prefix ki without a separate word meaning if. John akisoma kwa bidii atafaulu mtihani. A direct translation of this could be, John studying hard, he will pass the exam. But this is understood to mean, if John studies hard, he will pass the exam. Now imagine that it is the day after John's exam, and Mary asks you whether he passed. You have not heard whether John passed or failed the exam, but Mary tells you that he studied hard. In this case, you can say, if John studied hard, I'm sure he passed the exam. Because you and Mary both know that John studied hard, it is possible to replace if with since. Since John studied hard, I'm sure he passed the exam. Both of these sentences mean something like, I'm sure John passed the exam because, as we both know, he studied hard. In Swahili, if we know that John did in fact study hard, it is not possible to use ikiwa or ki, which we saw earlier. Instead, the word kama, which means as, is used, along with the past tense prefix li. Kama John alisoma kwa bidii, alifaulu mtihani. As John studied hard, he passed the exam. Now imagine a different situation in which John decided to play football instead of studying, and as a result, he failed the exam. Now you can say, if John had studied hard, he would have passed the exam. This means that in fact John did not pass the exam because he didn't study hard. In this situation, Swahili speakers will use yet another expression. The verbs in both the if clause and the consequent clause will have the prefix nge, which indicates that something could have happened but did not. John angesoma kwa bidii angefaulu mtihani. If John would have studied hard, he would have passed the exam. We have just seen that English speakers can use if when the situation described by the if clause is uncertain. If John studies hard, instead of playing football, he will pass the exam. When the if clause is known to be true, if John studied hard, which we both know he did, he certainly passed the exam. And when the if clause is not true, if John had studied hard, he would have passed the exam. But he didn't study hard, and so he didn't pass the exam. All these different English sentences use the word if, but the verbs in the if clauses have different tenses: studies, studied, had studied. As we have seen, in other languages like Swahili, there is no equivalent of if in English that can be used in all of these situations. Because of this, when you translate conditional sentences from English or from other languages, such as New Testament Greek, it is important to know how the conditional sentence is being used. For example, in Matthew chapter 19, verse 17, Jesus says to a man, "If you want to receive eternal life, keep the commandments." If this is translated into Swahili using the ki form, the meaning is that Jesus is unaware whether the man wants to receive eternal life or not, and in fact, some Swahili translators have used ki here. Actually, though, Jesus is answering the question, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? So in this case, Jesus knows that the man does in fact want to receive eternal life, which means that this sentence should be translated using comma rather than ki. In some other languages, it might be more natural to say something like, "Since you want to receive eternal life, keep the commandments," or even, "You must keep the commandments in order to receive eternal life." In summary, a conditional sentence has two parts: an if clause that describes a situation, and a consequence clause, which must be true if the if clause is true. In English and some other languages, if clauses can describe situations that are hypothetical, that is, possibly true or possibly false, as well as situations that are known to be true and situations that are not true. In many other languages, different expressions are used, and sometimes the equivalent of if can only be used in hypothetical situations. So it is important for translators to recognize how a conditional sentence is being used in order to translate it accurately.